Okay. So just for your information, Sam, we normally go for about 40 minutes. If we go a little bit over time, if you've got an extra few minutes spare, that'll be great too. But around the 40-minute mark is how we tend to sort of go with these things. Hello, audience, wherever you may hail. I'm your host, John Bruni. Welcome to The Focus. Join us as we explore some of the world's most fascinating and essential contemporary developments, shedding a spot of light in a world filled with alternative fact darkness. In this podcast, we'll be checking out a book, Humane, How the United States Abandoned Peace and Reinvented War by Professor Samuel Moyn. Samuel is Henry R. Luce Professor of Jurisprudence at Yale Law School and Professor of History at Yale University. Samuel, welcome to The Focus.
Thanks for having me.
Samuel, of all the modern countries of the world, the United States seems to have been the one that has placed the most significant emphasis on achieving a level of technology designed to make war cleaner and more surgical. We saw this during World War II when the US countered its patterns of bombing over Nazi Germany to Britain's led by Arthur Bomber Harris. And quoting Harris, "The aim of the combined bomber offensive should be unambiguously stated as the destruction of German cities, the killing of German workers, the disruption of civilized life throughout Germany, the destruction of houses, public utilities, transport, and lives, the creation of a refugee problem on an unprecedented scale, and the breakdown of morale both at home and at the battlefronts by fear of extended and intensified bombing are accepted and intended aims of our bombing policy. They are not byproducts of attempting to hit factories," end quote. How significant was America's strategic bombing perspective over that of the British in crafting a different methodology for the application of military firepower?
I'd say not significant at all. I think the distinction between American bombing of Germany and British, although certainly Bomber Harris was incredibly explicit, has been overblown. And if we just shift the scene to the Pacific Theater, we find, not dissimilar American practices that actually were much more grievous in terms of, cities leveled and lives lost to fire bombing and later nuclear bombing. And that, I think, fit with just the general pattern of states. That's why at Nuremberg, no one was held accountable for targeting civilians with aerial bombardment because everyone did it. What changed happened after that. And I think America did become preeminent, but mainly because Britain and other old European empires, in a sense, left the field of warfare altogether, having fought after World War II some big wars of decolonization, Malaya, Kenya, etc. They kind of took protection from the United States, which had to do a lot of dirty work for a long time, including in Vietnam, where roughly similar aerial bombardment continued. And then I think, in my account, things began to change. And it's because in the 90s and 2000s, America was the last great power standing that initiated a big war on terror, of course, with Brits and others in tow, but it playing a minor role. That it was kind of leading the advancement of warfare just at the right time for these new technological possibilities to become available, notably the armed drone. I think behind it all, though, is a new moral culture about how we permissibly wage war that has left the way that Americans and Brits and Europeans in general used to fight war a kind of distant memory, although with always, continuing brutality today.
It's interesting that you should say that because, my understanding of American defense acquisition, I've done a PhD on Australian defense acquisition, so it sort of brings out these kind of historical facts. And just on what you were saying earlier about how the Americans were far less discriminating in their bombing campaign over Japan, I mean, US Army Air Force General Curtis Lee May, he made the claim that they couldn't be as discriminating in their targeting over Japan because of weather conditions, which lent the bombing campaign
Correct.
over Japan to be much better in terms of using low-level nighttime bombing with incendiary devices. And of course,
Right.
as our listeners would know, back in those days, many Japanese cities had houses made out of paper and wood. So really, it comes down to another thing. Do we tend to be a little bit more brutal on our enemies when we see them as different from ourselves, and we try to be a bit more humane on those that we see as similar?
I wouldn't deny on your general point that there were differences, you know, in the conduct of aerial bombardment, by the major powers in the war. That's not my claim. My claim is that it's not that Americans were already humane in World War II.
Mm,
Of
mm,
course, LeMay cites as let's call it extenuation that he was in a different kind of tactical situation. But the truth is that both he and his flyers had no moral problem with burning the Japanese to death,
yeah.
including women and children. And LeMay says this, and of course he says it very famously as advice in the Vietnam era
Mm, mm,
about how he would run the Vietnam War.
mm,
And so I don't think it's right to um, kind of leave out that the Pacific War was uh, as historians like John Dower have, I think, brilliantly shown, a kind of
mm.
race war for Americans. Of course,
Yes,
it was a race war for the Japanese.
yes.
And what that meant is that the value of Asian lives was cheap for not just those, airmen,
Mm,
but the American population at home, which didn't make the conduct of the campaign of public moral significance. I mean, the number of people in any country who had moral qualms about the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki is minuscule
mm,
then. And so I think you're getting at something very important, but the truth is it seems like we're dealing with two facts. One is that, of course, the United States over time ends up fighting wars across, let's call them boundaries of race and religion.
mm.
Um, that doesn't mean it was, playing nice guy over Germany,
Yeah.
uh, and the Norden bomb site, that was supposed to distinguish its campaign from the Brits didn't work that well,
Mhm.
and Americans did a lot of damage, including civilian damage, over Germany as well. And that's why, in addition to this, I think, important factor about kind of race and religion, and how when people are different, we treat them less well, which is like a general truth about our societies domestically, and
Mhm.
of course, our world internationally. There's this bigger truth, which is that great power war, whoever it's fought against, has been drifting in a new direction. New expectations are being applied to it. No one wanted the war on Germany or Japan to be humane,
Mm.
but a big constituency of people after the 70s have wanted great power uh, war, including the kinds of counterinsurgent wars that my book is mostly about, to be fought with more care and kindness. And
Mm.
I'm trying to get at that novelty, which wasn't in sight, I think, in World War II.
Yeah.
No matter who the victims were or the targets were.
Interestingly enough, as technologies improved, into the 1970s, we had the beginnings of the revolution in military affairs. And one of the things that I'd noticed, and is the fact that as technology came on stream for the American military industrial complex to make aircraft more discriminating in their targeting systems, artillery the same. The fact of the matter is that these systems became far, far more expensive per unit than any other preceding weapon that we've ever had, which was a good thing because it allowed us to be a bit more discriminating, as you rightly point out, in these other sort of brush fire wars that were taking place in third world countries. But in the end, did we not create a rod for our own back? Because you've got America, which is a global power. It needs to have a quantity of weaponry to maintain a global position. But as time goes on, we see the American forces shrinking in size because of the cost of the weapons that they are putting into their orders of battle. How do you counter that, or can you counter that?
It's a fascinating, question. First, like a general comment, I want to resist, the suggestion that, well, our ancestors would have been more humane. They just didn't yet have the technological capacity.
Right.
They didn't want to be humane. And
Yep.
in fact, that's why they developed the weapons they did. It's true that the Nord bomb sight didn't work all that well, but they also invented napalm. And the explicit goal of that weapon is to kill as many people, including civilians, as possible in the most cruel way. And so it's not that I can deny that in our time, armed drones, and many other technologies allow precision that a few people did dream about in the past, not that many, but that people wanted those weapons and wanted to fight in a new way. And I think that's for a lot of different reasons. I think that the decolonization of the world is the biggest, since after all, all the peoples who were the victims of brutal imperial war for centuries got out of empire, in immensely brutal wars. And it's less, allowed in the international system for at least great powers to go to the dark side, and that was the central debate around George W. Bush, whether he could just revert as if this change had never happened. So let's link the technological evolution to some kind of moral evolution that's, going alongside it, that also has, technological factors involved, like changes in media and so forth and so on. Now, your more specific question, I think, is also really important. But I would, point to things like the need to immunize American forces from harm as an even bigger, reason than the one I'm pointing to in my book, the need to treat the targets less cruelly. Because, we know there's a big debate at the end of Vietnam, which I briefly reference, about whether to, end conscription and turn to an all volunteer force. But even with volunteers, George W. Bush sees his popularity tank because of body bags coming home in the initial heavy footprint phase of the war on terror that he begins in Afghanistan and Iraq. And Barack Obama understands that even immunizing Americans further than you can do just with, technological superiority needs to be done. And that's why the armed drone and the teams of special forces become the weapons of choice. Now, of course, that does presuppose the revolution in military affairs, which has been talked about in various circles. Didn't stop the big footprint Iraq war and so forth. But, to me, that factor about kind of the turn to precision it really, requires us to tell a story about domestic legitimation and how the death and injury of American soldiers has driven a lot of the evolution of the war on terror. Now, interestingly, it's still the case that even though Obama changed the war, Donald Trump ran against war and won big amongst veterans, first in competing with his fellow Republicans, for whom it was taboo at that point in February, March 2016, when he was running, to say the Iraq war was a mistake.
Mm.
And then when Trump ran in the general election against Hillary, veterans supported him hugely. So it's the legacy of that early period of Afghanistan and Iraq and creating a lot of dead people, Americans, and injured veterans who have votes to cast for Trump later, I think requires a lot of, thought in retrospect.
Sam, I recall that at the height of Obama's drone war against Pakistan, I had the occasion to speak with the Pakistani High Commissioner to Australia about how her country saw America's drone war against the Taliban and other Muslim extremist groups. The answer was not complimentary. The High Commissioner did not see the imposition of remote American air power as a humane way of dispatching a common set of enemies, but as a complete nullification of Pakistani sovereignty. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, there are a lot of things that, can lead us to critique targeted killings, which I would use as like the larger category, of which drone warfare is like a subset. And then there are other ways of killing people, off hot battlefields, which occurred, in 10 to 15 countries through the Obama and Trump years, not just the original two theaters of the war on terror. And one big one has been that too many civilians die collaterally. Now, Obama, would say in his major speeches, I think reasonably, compared to what? My alternative is Bush's war. In other words, brutal war with lots of troops and even more death and even more collateral damage. And it's not that he didn't promise to make the war more humane than it actually was, but it was central to his addresses about the war on terror, notably when he kind of rolled out the drone program in 2013 at the National Defense University, that this was a precise weapon that would cause the fewest, civilian casualties of any alternative that he had. Now, I think it's interesting, also sad, that the response has been, well, there were still too many. Not that that's wrong, but it's like begging him to do something that he'd already started, and in a way asking him to perfect humane war, as if it were okay to begin with, because there are these other lines of critique that have nothing to do with the brutality or humanity of targeted killing. One is that in certain instances, it's a violation of other countries' sovereignty. Now, that's a contested point. We know it was in certain cases, not others, where the United States got consent. And there are still stories of, a fax machine through which you would kind of inform the Pakistanis of a coming strike, which they could never, publicly consent to allowing, but did in practice.
Yep.
Then there are like other, critiques that I find really powerful, which have to do with whether targeted killings violate the United Nations Charter or violate human rights law. Because after all, when there's no war on between country A and country B, and there's someone bad in country B that country A doesn't like, well, since when did it have the right to just go kill that person, even if the country where that person is located consents?
Yep.
There's no war. Maybe there ought to be police, international police, domestic police that rounds up the usual suspects. And if you think that you have human rights outside wartime, then the idea that you can be struck at any time off a battlefield is very sinister. We would never allow it in our countries, but it became normal. And so this I think is a bigger critique. And note, it has nothing to do with whether, there's a lot of care taken in organizing the strike. So there are a lot of arguments you can make about kind of what might have made the rise of targeted killings unholy. And I tried to write this book to say the American debate, which is about whether too many civilians are dying, is in a sense misconceived because it's the narrowest critique. It kind of presupposes that this ought to be happening at all.
Interesting you should mention the idea of a policing role being at the center of a lot of these kind of brushfire wars that America gets involved in. Do you think that in the future, as technology continues to improve, we will start seeing more of a policing role being forced upon military forces, especially US forces, since the US is still leading the charge in terms of high tech? That what we're seeing at the moment is almost like a transition from, the strong arm of the military to something a little bit softer, because you've got the God's eye view of your constellation of satellites, you've got Starlink, you've got all of these things which will allow technology to move in ways that 15 years ago we could only barely imagine. So that's going to fundamentally alter how America fights wars, right?
It is. I mean, arguably policing is just kind of part of, let's say, historic imperial rule. Like sometimes you have to fight big hot wars, but even when you don't, you may be involved in a lot of extraterritorial violence that is confined in certain ways.
Yeah.
Now I think the difference is that in the old days it was still, very bloody with very little concern for moral limits. And what struck me is not the fact of policing off hot battlefields or outside, formal war zones, is that like it had to be, argued about and legitimated, including by all the senior politicians, Obama and so forth, in a radically distinctive way, where they assured people of the moral constraints for the sake of the target countries and victim communities themselves. I do think it will continue. I mean, it seems like the recent elections since Bush's popularity tanked suggests that America won't be engaging in heavy footprint war anytime soon. That went disastrously for Bush. And I think a lot of people recognize that it led not just to Obama's, ascendancy relative to Hillary Clinton, whom he faced, but Trump's too, relative to Republicans and Hillary. Again, and that's why you've seen Joe Biden promise to end the forever war, withdraw from Afghanistan, and so forth. But the shadow war, this humane, legally regulated policing, I think, is set to endure across hierarchy. Those who can will do it, and those who receive it, not having any real choice in the matter, will see it happen to people who are located on their territories, even when they formally consent. It's not real. It's not something that they would ideally want, but they're living in a world in which Americans say, well, we'll never do this in Paris if there's a terrorist there, but we need to do it in Badlands, which means, a certain number of places.
All right. Well, then again, a country that isn't blessed with the technological prowess of the United States only has brutal war as its bottom line, right? So
Correct.
we're seeing this play out in Ukraine today. I mean, Russian forces conducting a ruthless method of fighting, targeting primarily civilians and cities, as opposed to Ukrainian troops in the field. Can we safely assume that this was Russia's only real option, that Russia's way of war fighting is the antithesis of American?
I would say it's different, and we've discussed how everything's different from everything else, American and British bombing of Germany in World War II. But is there a kind of, is it the polar opposite? I think that's harder to say. Certainly it is, if you look at Putin's record in Chechnya or Georgia. On the other hand, Iraq, a ground war like those, was incredibly brutal too. And it's worth mentioning that Putin fought those wars under the European human rights regime. He's basically been asked to leave now. And so there were a lot of court cases where Putin's excesses in Chechnya, et cetera, were kind of penalized financially, and victims were awarded, cash, which never happened in the case of American warfare in Iraq. However, if we're comparing next gen American warfare, the kind of second phase of the war on terror, this shift to light and no footprint mechanisms, well, of course, what Putin did in Chechnya and Georgia and now seems to be doing in Ukraine is indeed very different. Now, it's kind of interesting because some people would hypothesize that this concern about the victims and so forth would be, understandable in certain sectors of the societies of liberal countries, but would have no play in a country like Russia. But it turns out that Russian state media in the beginning of the war was kind of, extolling the humanity of the Russian army at the time of the invasion. Now that's broken down completely. And it does seem to be on the brutal side. We're still in early months in a sense. So, it's understandable, but still true that the civilian death toll is nothing in Ukraine compared to the 200,000 that we say died in Iraq between 2003 and 11. So it's a hard comparison. I wouldn't say it's like white and black, but I do agree that the Obama's war, this more humane war, is just very different than Putin's current war in Ukraine on if we're interested in like the manner of its conduct. Now, if we're interested in something, I think we ought to care much more about the terms of its initiation. Well, a lot of American war was blatantly illegal in notably the Iraq war, but other parts of the war on terror, like we've talked about, bombing unconsenting countries, totally illegal. But of course, Ukraine is the same. If we're interested in the United Nations Charter and the prohibition of force, there I think we get some similarities that are worth pondering.
Yeah, I'm curious about something though. I mean, a lot of information that's hit the public headlines in terms of Russia's order of battle, the breakdown of Russian armor, all the things that many military analysts, including myself, prior to the events of February 24, we all thought that the Russians were kind of on par with the Americans at a technological standpoint. The Russians have got their, God's eye view of planet Earth. They've got their constellation of satellites. There was this kind of parity that we thought from a technological perspective that the Russians had. And so therefore, we also thought that they would fight better, differently, kind of more along lines of the United States. This has not come to pass. So what would you say about, had the Russian military industrial complex not been as corrupt, had they had more paid more attention to the final products that were hitting Russian soldiers, that the tanks actually worked, and targeting pods were put in aircraft, and precision guided munition stocks were of a quantity and quality that they could actually impose onto Ukraine, do you think that we would have actually seen the Russians fight similar to the Americans? Or was it they were so hampered by their military industrial complex corruption problems that there was just no chance in hell? They would have just fought the way they fight and the way their reputation in World War II, like to get their hands dirty sort of thing, that they would have always done that anyway?
That is a fantastic question, but it's an immense counterfactual.
Oh, yeah, it is.
Before I answer it, let me just mention in passing that let's just remember that most American wars have failed.
Mm-hmm.
Now, some have not, like the first Gulf War.
Yeah.
It's only fair to say the second Gulf War went spectacularly well from a kind of military perspective in its initial days and weeks.
Mm.
But I would say many wars we've seen Americans conduct have also been, quixotic and have, led to a lot of reversals sooner or later. So again, why is the comparison some notion of, American excellence when that's not demonstrated? And Americans can make mistakes and have in spades. Now, you're of course right that, those of Putin's generals were revealed very rapidly. And the failure to achieve air superiority and knock out, Ukrainian assets in, in short order, as America did in, doesn't all of its wars, but in the second Iraq War, the second Gulf War, was pretty remarkable. And it just, I mean, I'm no expert, but it strikes me that it was so fast that the strategic and tactical defects of the Russian military were revealed to the world, that the only explanation is its military capacity and preparation, the day before the operations commenced. And that is very different, I think, than in many recent American wars. So, I mean, is corruption the answer? I'm sure that's a huge part of it. And you're certainly right to single out that factor.
I'm John Bruni, and you're listening to Sage International's The Focus podcast. And from the US, we're speaking with author and senior scholar in jurisprudence and history at Yale University, Professor Samuel Moyn. Sam, at what point do you believe state-sanctioned assassination will become the new normal in warfare, especially with new, more subtle drones that can kill anyone posing a threat to the US-led international order?
If you mean targeted killings, it's normalized. I mean, it's amazing, and I recount in the book that just a few months before September 11th, George W. Bush denounced Israel for its kind of pioneering targeted killings program, and it was widely seen to be noxious as a practice to engage in this practice, which we can define as assassination if we want. And interestingly, there's supposed to be a ban on assassinations in American law. Mm-hmm. But we can also call it extrajudicial killing, or we can just call it targeted killing to just, be neutral and say it's about the killing of individuals who are not present in battle spaces. And of course, Putin has had his own targeted killings program. His preferred weapon is poison. And he's killed many fewer with that program. Yeah. But it seems as if, assassination has become normalized. Now, it's worth noting that Biden, on taking office, initiated a review of the drone program, or maybe more broadly, the targeted killing program. We can say that it's very doubtful that the legal permission slips that American government lawyers have given the executive, as their client, are not going to be, shredded anytime soon. And so even if there are, let's say, lulls in the drone program, which there has been under Biden, or lulls in targeted killing as a practice because, for example, Trump beat ISIS for a time. it always can come back because the legal groundwork is there. And of course, they've built a massive drone infrastructure, notably far into sub-Saharan Africa. So I would say as of today, it's a normalized practice, and we could organize against it if people think, it's wrong. But it's also the case that it's restricted in fact to across these hierarchies. So, it's if you're geopolitically weak, you're likely to be on the receiving end of targeted killings. But it's rare that it's going to happen in what people used to call civilized countries. Now, Putin has ignored that double standard and been very happy to poison people in England. So does that mean Americans will start ignoring it too? It's unlikely, but it does seem like it's now baked in and kind of something we have to accept, even if we think it's unholy.
Sam, if war becomes humane, from a philosophical perspective, what lessons do we learn from warfare? I mean, isn't warfare meant to be a terrible episodic event with a barbarity that people eventually recoil from, not a constant feature of human affairs?
Well, I'm not sure how many people recoiled from barbarity for centuries. They did want to contain it. They passively accepted war as eternal, but also episodic. And I think that's what's changed in our time, that we have decided that in the face of certain enemies, we initiate wars, but don't ever terminate them. And, what that means is that I think humanity has arisen as a feature of this new kind of war that seems, to drag on. And it becomes a kind of, policing for those states that are powerful enough to do it, and its humanization helps it, escape notice. And I think that I think we shouldn't be surprised by this outcome, since again, there were these empires operating in many of the same places that had a kind of permanent security problem when they were actually trying to rule the places or expand to annex them or whatever. It's just that it was much more brutally conducted kind of by consensus than seems allowed now. I would never say that war is humane. I would say there's this emergent thing, which is that it's more humane than the old counterinsurgency, the old shadow war. And in part, I think people are fatalistic about the possibility of ending it or finding some international policing solution, which was originally supposed to be what the United Nations was for. And so I think, for the time being, we ruefully say this seems sinister to some of us, but it also, the conditions for revisiting it and restoring endpoints to war seem less credible. It's, we're not fighting the kind of enemy that accepts, peace terms. And, we don't want to make peace when we've erected terrorism into the enemy, because that's not, you're never done with it. There's always the next threat. And so I think that's the main reason for their transformation of war into a kind of endless thing. And I just was interested in how some people want it to be less brutal than the old imperial kind of, security problem was allowed to be.
With regard to chains of command, shall we say, is there not a bit of a I don't know. I'm a bit of a sci-fi fan, so I tend to see things both as a glass half full kind of guy and a glass half empty in certain circumstances. But the political executive in the United States can now give an order to conduct a strike mission that bypasses Congress and other political checks and balances on the use of force. If warfare is made the plaything of the political executive, with the people having no say in how its armed forces are used, Isn't this a dystopian outcome despite all the utopianism associated with fighting humane war?
Oh, for sure. I treat it as such in the book. I mean,
Yeah.
I'm interested in how a certain vision of reform is actually kind of dystopian and fatalistic because it's trying to bring a kind of cosmetic approach to something that seems quite sinister, and that again we would hope never to see in our own lands.
Mm.
I opened the book with an account of a wedding in where I live in Connecticut, of people
Yeah,
who
that's right.
think they're good.
Yeah.
They voted for someone who promises to replace the brutal war with the humane war,
Mm.
but they would never, tolerate drones over their wedding unless it was for, the wedding video,
Yes, that's right.
as people, send drones up today for wedding videography. Whereas a wedding, in the Pakistani borderlands or Yemen or whatever, I mean, that could be, a drone with a very different lethal purpose.
Yeah.
Um, and I think, the 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 outcome is not one I'm happy with. That's why I wrote the book. But
Mm.
I think we need to be realists and try to hear from Obama, who says, well, look, I had to do this because my sole alternative was killing more Americans,
Mm.
killing more civilians collaterally with lots of troops.
Mm.
And, I couldn't do nothing,
Mm.
even though I won the Nobel Peace Prize in my first year,
Mhm.
when I really executed this shift from the heavy footprint to the light and no footprint war. So it's an account of, a depressing outcome,
Mm.
and the question is, could there be a better one? Was Obama wrong? Were all those strikes really necessary?
Mm.
Was the default we used to have that, borders were supposed to be sacrosanct, and
Yeah.
war was supposed to be war and not kind of something that had mutated into humane policing, humane and scare quotes, obviously.
Of course. Look, Sam, Italian dictator Benito Mussolini once said, and I quote, "War is to man what maternity is to woman." From a philosophical and doctrinal viewpoint, I do not believe in perpetual peace, end quote. Through modern military technology, and specifically American modern military technology, are we close to achieving a fascist perpetual war style of thinking? Have we accomplished it indeed?
It's an interesting question, very provocative. I mean, I would say that there was a very old tradition which culminated in fascism of seeing, recurrent war as essential to the sustenance of masculinity,
Yeah.
or even civilizational health, which would get soft and feminine if there was never blood spilled.
Mm.
Now, in a different age, is it just, a continuation of fascism? I don't think so, because it's someone like Obama is, although at one point he kind of brags that he's become such an efficient killer,
Mm.
also is, very reluctant. And he tells his staff that, more people slip on in the bathtub than die in terrorist assaults, and many more people die in road accidents,
Mm.
and the government isn't expected to eliminate all the risk.
Yeah.
So why in this one area, which justifies this endless war? And above all, it edits the fighters out.
Mm.
So I think Mussolini would have regarded the antiseptic, non-participatory nature of the new humane form of war with horror, because
Mm.
it precisely doesn't allow invasion and hand-to-hand fighting and revivifying your masculinity through engaging the enemy, whom you never see except on a screen, and you
Mm.
kill with, as if it were a video game.
Mm. Actually, you just raised a point which I have to return to. With regard to drone warfare, I've read many accounts of those people in their refrigerated cargo boxes where they do a lot of the remote flying. You know, these
Yeah,
people, they've lost a sense of the damage that they're doing on the other side, because it is very much like a video game. And a lot
right,
of these people are suffering from their own version of post-traumatic stress disorder. So it's not a matter of,
correct,
you know, there are no victims in uniform
correct,
fighting this new kind of war.
correct.
It's psychologically taxing, but in a very different way from being on the ground and getting involved in hand-to-hand fighting. Can you explain for our listeners, you know, how from your research, you know, it kind of works out for the average American drone pilot sitting 5,000 away from the battlefield? Yeah.
No, it's an excellent point, and I'd recommend, since I don't write much about that, a brilliant recent book by Yale Press called Dirty Work, where he actually kind of goes and talks to drone pilots, but analogizes them, you know, in other parts of the book
Mhm.
to communities that are doing things that the rest of us don't want, you know, trash collection and other things. And, you know, the point is that there's some group of people who's like doing the things we'd rather not kind of know about,
Mhm.
but are at the same time essential for the continuity of society. And you know, the moral issue is that we dishonor these people, and we foist a lot of kind of pain on them for doing what we refuse to do for our own sake.
Mhm.
Um, Now, of course, I don't think we should have a drone program. So it's not like trash collection where like someone has to do it. But it's absolutely true that, you know, drone piloting is dirty work in the sense that it's the kind of work that citizens have foisted upon people who can experience a lot of pain and post-traumatic stress. At the same time, it's clean work in
Mhm.
historically new way, because those same people doing dirty work aren't being asked to, you know, go out to India to police, you know, the colonies,
Mhm.
and, you know, exposing them to much worse than the drone pilots are facing today, not, you know, without at all trivializing the psychological stress they're under. So, you know, it's a really interesting point, and gets us at how, you know, humane war involves a lot of dirty work, just maybe less than in the past of counterinsurgency, which was incredibly violent, as we know from, you know, every study of it.
Mhm. Samuel, I can't leave you without asking these final questions and using your book as our guide. With many countries having subscribed to the use of cheaper Russian military technology and training doctrines, where brutality in war is still a means to an end, is America's philosophy of humane war going to trump this internationally? And what will a triumphant American humane war philosophy mean for those countries such as China? Will they continue to uphold the promise of wartime brutality and wide-scale destruction as their ultimate deterrent to the United States?
You know, I'd say it's too soon to tell. I mean, we know that, you know, this has gone further for certain great powers, and I think America, just because it has fought so many places and grappled with these issues in the central public debates of the war on terror. I mean, I think it's a good case study. But, you know, Australia, Great Britain, France, they're involved in foreign war on
Mm,
a daily basis. And we would have to kind of check up on whether they're fighting more humanely, less humanely. I think they are fighting more humanely on balance than even the Americans. It's just they're much kind of smaller
mm,
a factor and kind of more peripheral a case study. Now, when we look across the world, brutality of an kind of unreconstructed nature is often the rule.
mm,
Usually it's kind of there's compensation for that fact, for that fact, and the reality that many of these wars are not fought by the most well-funded militaries, and so that has an effect on how much destruction they can unleash at any given point.
mm,
On China, you know, I'm I don't want to commit, but it's just very much worth noting that their designs for global power seem much more economic than military. To date, they have one overseas base, which is in Djibouti,
Yep.
compared to 1,000 or more that Americans maintain. Sometimes leasing islands from allies to place them. People talk about an invasion of Taiwan or the skullduggery in the South China Sea, but to date we have not seen an extraterritorial Chinese war. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, since the days of Korea, when Mao sent troops across the Yalu to meet Douglas MacArthur. So I think it's very hypothetical to ask, are we heading into a new era in which China will be fighting a lot in the way that America has lately? And I'm skeptical now, but it could happen. And then it will be very interesting how far this American development of humanizing its wars has kind of changed the baseline for other great powers, including non-liberal ones.
Oh, absolutely. And the reason why I raised China, of course, is that we're just about to have a federal election, and it has been an election characterized by security and China as the threat to Australian interests in the local regions. So, of course, we're all very interested in how perhaps a revitalized China will enter the world at some point.
Of course.
And I think one of the things that we also can say is that, modern China has, well, except for the Korean War, obviously, but modern China has fought very few wars. The last one was in 1979 against Vietnam, and they didn't come out of that one very well. So we have to wait and see to have an idea of the strength of Chinese military modernization. The Chinese have not been tested, and it doesn't seem that the CCP wanted to be tested. I think perhaps they may have some very unpleasant surprises if they do decide to test it out.
I mean, they are engaging in a lot more military spending. Like Russia, they're deeply entangled in the foreign economy of Australia, the United States, so many other. So it would be deeply risky to really what they've brilliantly set up to learning the lesson of what happens as when a Putin crosses a border, for the Chinese to follow suit would be very surprising.
Indeed. Samuel, thank you very much for sharing your insights on The Focus.
Thank you. Lovely to be here.
Henry R. Luce Professor of Jurisprudence at Yale Law School and Professor of History at Yale University, Samuel Moyn. His book, Humane, How the United States Abandoned Peace and Reinvented War, can be found at your local bookstore or your favorite online purveyor of the written word. I encourage you to read this thought-provoking book. That's it for this episode. We hope that you enjoyed the show. My thanks to our guest, Samuel Moyn, and to producers Neil Smart and Malcolm Hughes. Thanks also to the Ozcast Network. You can find The Focus on the Sage International website at sageinternational.com.au, the Ozcast Network, iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, and TuneIn. So if you like what you've heard, please like and review us on your favorite podcast platform. Until next time, I'm John Bruni, and you've been listening to Sage International's The Focus. That was fantastic.
Great. Thanks. Wonderful questions. And thanks for having me.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that, Sam. You have a great evening.
Okay. You too. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.